at Utah State. She's got her bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley in environmental science. She's got her MS and PhD both from Yale in ecosystem sciences and environmental studies. Then she did postdocs at Dartmouth and University of Vermont. She is in the Wildland Resources Department at Utah State as well as the Ecology Center. She's done a lot of research around the world. She'll talk with us about some of the stuff that she's done a little closer to home. She's done stuff actually real close to home here, some of it in collaboration with the division. She studied the effect of rodents on shrub step seeds, and also how increased precipitation will impact rangelands in Utah. She's also looked at the mechanisms of plant invasion and control effectiveness in the Intermountain West, so all stuff that we're interested in. And then a little more recently, she's been working in Alaska and Hawaii, and if you guys haven't figured that out, that's state 49 and state 50. So she'll be talking a little bit about how those things might actually affect the stuff that we do here in state 45.
Oh, is that what it is? Yeah, I hope so. I've been working in Hawaii for a while, and so I'm going to start with that. And the Alaska stuff's a little bit more recent, so we might end with that. Thank you all for coming. And I was thinking that I might kind of make this a little casual. If you guys feel like interrupting me or asking questions or have comments about something I'm saying, feel free to jump in. I always think it's more engaging if it's a conversation. So let me know if you're thinking anything about what I'm saying. So today I'm going to start by kind of talking about amphibian and reptile invasions. And I thought I'd start with a global picture because I think that makes it maybe more relevant to Utah. But this is some data that a guy, Fred Krause, came up with. And he's working at the Bishop Museum in Hawaii, so he knows a lot about herps in Hawaii. And he's also discovered a bunch of new species in Papua New Guinea. Now he's working for Wildlife Services in Colorado, but he's a herp guy. And he put together this global database about reptile and amphibian invasions. And this is one of the figures. And I have a couple figures from his stuff that I'll show, so I want to give you a little background. But as you're probably aware, the number of introduced or non-native species in any taxa is increasing, right? Pretty much everywhere. So probably not surprising to see this. The kind of cutoff at the end he attributes to just a lag effect of just people not reporting yet, and this was written in the early 2000s. The invasion that I'm going to talk a lot about at the beginning is an invasion that I've been studying for about 15 years. And I started studying the coqui frog in Puerto Rico for my dissertation work, and it's native to Puerto Rico. And when I was working there, this paper came out by Fred Krause, who's in Hawaii, and he said this frog has invaded Hawaii, and this is something that we need to pay attention to. And so he wrote this kind of brief paper about it. But I'll get back to some of the hypotheses he came up with. But anyway, he mentioned this introduction, and I was working in Puerto Rico at the time, and I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. The species I'm studying in its native range is in this new place, and they're really concerned about what it might do, and I would love to go there and figure that out. And so when I got the job at Utah State, it was one of the things I first started doing, and I've been doing it since I've been there. So our work has shown that actually there were two introductions, one to the Big Island and one to Maui. Have any of you guys been to Hawaii and heard the coqui frogs? Do you guys know anything about this invasion? Nobody knows anything about it?
I've heard about it, and it's real noisy.
Yeah, real noisy. You hear it as soon as you get off the plane if you're on the Big Island. It's right at the airports. Okay, do any of you guys go to Hawaii on vacation? Okay, so you're interested in Hawaii, and besides it's freezing outside, so let's think about a tropical place today. So it invaded the Big Island, and then it also invaded Maui. I'll tell you a little bit about the species. So it's a terrestrial tropical frog. It's pretty small, but it's extremely noisy, And it has direct development. So unlike the frogs that you guys might be familiar with in Utah, it doesn't require a water body to breed in. It lays its eggs in a leaf litter, and frogs come straight out of the eggs. And they're little teeny froglets that are about the size of a bug that are on the forest floor. So one of the reasons that Fred Krause thought this was going to be of concern was because he knew that in the native range they have really high densities. About 20,000 frogs per hectare is pretty common in Puerto Rico. Maybe if some of you have been to Puerto Rico, you've heard them too. They're everywhere in Puerto Rico. And our researchers showed in Hawaii that they can reach densities up to 90,000 frogs per hectare. So that is like you're walking through the woods and you just, oh, there's one, there's one, there's one. And you're just kind of surrounded by them. So the interesting thing, though, about this is it's the Big Island invasion that's really been devastating. They tried to control them when they got there, and they didn't really start the effort right away. And so they just kind of wound up spreading across the Big Island. And they're pretty much almost everywhere on the Big Island that they maybe will go at this point. But on the flip side, Oahu in Hawaii were able to eradicate the coqui frog. And they did that with chemical control and by removing vegetation. And they both kind of only had one population at the time that they were doing that occupied about 6 hectares. But it's pretty impressive that they were able to eradicate from these 2 islands a vertebrate invasive species just using kind of chemical control and mechanical control. Maui's story is not as positive. They have a single invasion that's occupying this big gulch, and despite lots of money and lots of effort, they have not been able to get rid of it from Maui. And that's also a different genetic introduction, which might be a concern in the future. So I'll tell you guys more about how they're doing the control over there. But
Okay, question for you. Did they
Yeah.
come in to non-native plant communities? Is that where they're getting started, or are they actually native plant communities?
So yeah, a couple things that remind me. First, I didn't say that they came in via nursery plants. So it was an accidental introduction. I probably should have mentioned that. And our genetic work shows that it might have only been a single clutch that started the invasion on the Big Island. They're extremely genetically homogeneous. And they don't have any of the color patterns and stuff that you see in Puerto Rico, which is kind of interesting. So if you guys have been to Hawaii, at least, you probably appreciate that a lot of what you're looking at, which is fun and colorful and beautiful, is not native to Hawaii, right? And so a lot of the lowlands in Hawaii have been replaced with non-native forests, and that's mostly where they are. They mostly are hanging out in certainly non-native dominated communities, but like ohia is the dominant native plant species in Hawaii, and that's kind of everywhere. And there are native bird species that are in the lowlands, and there are native insects that are in the lowlands. So they do overlap with some native species. But a lot of the areas that they're in might, like at least in Hawaii and Oahu, were in areas that they didn't mind denuding to get rid of them. So when Fred Krause wrote that original paper in '99, he said there could be 3 things that might be of concern about their invasion. One is that they can reach extremely high densities, and they're insectivores, and well, maybe like people in general don't care too much about insects. In Hawaii, they care about insects because a lot of them are endemic and have small populations and are rare. And so they were concerned that this insectivore that has such high numbers could reduce these endemic insects that they might care about. So that was kind of the first thing he proposed. He also proposed that because they're insectivores and a lot of the native birds that people care about in Hawaii are insectivorous, they might compete with the native birds for these insects. So there might be negative consequences for the native bird species. And then third, he proposed that there's a lot of introduced species in Hawaii besides the coqui, and rats and mongoose are among them. And he proposed that maybe they will serve as a novel food resource for these introduced mammals and maybe bolster their populations. And that has consequences, again, that we might be concerned about because these are known bird predators, for example. So these are some of the original ecological kind of concerns. But I should also mention that there's a lot of socioeconomic concerns of the invasion. And as has already been noted, they have an extremely loud mating call. And so, and because there's so many of them, it's just like this wall of chorus that you walk into. And I'll see if this works, but this is what they sound like. And so, you know, that depends on the level that I set my computer at, right? But it's really loud, and this level, this decibel level, is actually above the limit of noise pollution. It's like above the statute of Hawaii's like noise pollution limitation. So it's really loud, and people complain of hearing loss, and you know have all kinds of complaints about what it does to them to listen to this all night. Yeah.
Are they in Cuba?
This species is not in Cuba. There's a Cuban tree frog.
Or is just it's kind of a joke?
Oh,
Alluding to
Diplomatic tool.
Yeah.
right, yes,
Employees
yeah.
who are going down.
There are some, anyway. So, interestingly, there was an economic analysis done not too long after they invaded, and they found in that economic analysis that people's property values actually declined when they had frogs on their property. People were less likely to purchase them. And so there were measurable economic consequences to people, but also to nursery owners. As I said, they came in through nurseries, and they mostly spread through the sale of nursery plants, at least at the beginning. And so nurseries that had infestations experienced lost sales, and they also, it was put on them to deal with the invasion, so they had to manage the invasions. And, you know, and then there were all these regulations, like you can't sell infested plants between islands and things like that. And so there were a lot of consequences for people living there. So how did they kind of propose to control them? The first thing that they came up with was spraying caffeine, and this was back in 2001, and it was extremely effective. Yeah, if they sprayed it in a forest where there were frogs, the frogs died like instantly.
Except now the residents are all awake all night.
Yeah, and so there was actually a backlash by the general public because they didn't like the idea that caffeine was somehow being flowed through their system, and they, you know, didn't have control of it. So it was a 1-year EPA approved use, and then they never got approval beyond that. So they had to come up with something else. And what they came up with was citric acid, which is a food additive, and so presumably you can eat it and be okay. And so 16% citric acid is kind of the best way of getting rid of them, and that's what they pretty much currently use. And this is one control effort they did. One of my master's students studied how effective this was, but they helicopter dropped in citric acid into this natural area reserve on the Big Island to see how much it reduced frogs. And it reduced them, but when you do it on an island like Hawaii, where there's a lot of populations around there, on the Big Island, they just kind of move back in, and eventually they go back to where they were before. So eventually they stopped trying to do these types of things on the Big Island because it was kind of a lost cause. They're still doing this type of effort in that gulch in Maui. And so they have helicopter drops. They also have like PVC pipes that go down into the gulch, and they have ground operations spraying citric acid. This kind of shows you a little bit what that looks like, but they haven't been able to get rid of them out of that gulch. And one of the difficulties in working in these areas is that the terrain is just kind of intense, and so the frogs can hide in crevices, and you know, if you don't get every single one, it's hard to completely eradicate them.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
So is there like a overall state strategy, something like county by county, breakdown? Maybe something like You know, Kauai County, like, okay, it's exclusion.
Yeah, yeah, no,
uh,
yep,
Kauai County, containment.
yeah, no, there, yeah,
'Cause,
so,
I mean,
yeah, that is what it
you're not
is.
gonna eradicate from the Big Island.
Right, and,
Yeah.
and they don't do that anymore, and that's their, their stated management plan is not to get rid of them from the Big Island.
Okay.
And, yeah, and so, and for Kauai, it's to keep it koki-free, and same with Oahu, and Maui, it's to try to eradicate still. But yeah, every county has a different plan based on.
My impression of
yeah.
the state of Hawaii is they have a less restrained regulatory ethos than state ethos. So they could actually succeed regulating intercounty
Yeah.
nursery stock and,
Yeah, and I mean, there's a history of them being effective at this. Kauai does not have the mongoose, which is really surprising to me. But they have different management practices on different islands based on what they have. So back to, the ecological consequences, because I'm an ecologist after all. So this was a sign put up in one of their state parks, and we took a picture of this because my master's student was looking at whether or not the birds and kokis actually compete for prey. And this sign was sitting there saying, it competes with birds for insects. And we were like, wait, we haven't figured that out yet. So anyways, that's a picture for us. But I actually, over the last 10 years or so, I've had 3 master's students kind of focus on these 3 main hypotheses that Fred Krause came up with. So how do they affect insects? How do they affect birds, and how do they affect small mammals? And we did these studies on the Big Island, just because they're so widespread there, and we could look at kind of a diversity of habitats and ask these questions. We wound up working on 15 sites spread throughout the island, and you can see that they're mostly lowland sites and forested, because that's mostly where the koki is. And we decided to ask these questions at the landscape scale. And so what we did was we said, let's find places where the koki is like seemingly still invading, and that's usually kind of going upslope, or or just hasn't crossed a big road or something, but the habitat is seemingly very similar. And so that was kind of our criteria for finding sites. The sites where the koki's invaded, and where it hasn't invaded, that's pretty close by, and the habitat, as far as we can tell, every measure we've taken is very similar. So anything we see, we can kind of attribute to the frog. At least that will be what we think is going on. And so the first study we did was looking at insects on the 2 sides of those invasion fronts. My master's student Ryan Choi did that. And then we went back a few years later and we set up point count plots for birds on both sides of the invasion fronts, and we measured bird community responses to the frog. And then much more recently, my current master's student, Shane Hill, went back to look at the small mammal response, and so he set up trapping webs on both sides of the fronts to see if mongoose or rat populations are different, where the koki is or isn't among these 15 sites. And he added to this too and looked at, their diets, so are they eating kokis? And also set out camera traps to look at whether they were scavenging dead kokis that we put out. So, I'm not going to show a bunch of figures or whatever, I'll just tell you the take-home messages from all of these. So the first thing was looking at insects, and we did find a measurable change in the insect community. And that was kind of surprising to me, because insects are like so variable in space and time, and it can be hard to measure something consistent like a frog response across these diverse landscapes. But we did. We found that there was about a 30% reduction in leaf litter insects where the koki had invaded. And they mostly eat in the leaf litter in Hawaii, so that wasn't surprising. And a surprising result of this was that we saw Diptera flies increase where the kokis were. And we think that has to do with just the mass amount of decomposing bodies and fecal matter and stuff that they're producing when they invade, since there's so many of them. And so this study and a diet study we did on frogs kind of also confirmed this idea that they're mostly eating non-native insects, though, which is a good thing because we care about the native insects in Hawaii, but also not super surprising because these communities they're in are pretty non-native dominated. And then I had a student recently, Robin Smith, do her master's looking at the bird response, and we just this paper actually is coming out in January in the Condor. And we've gotten a little bit of press about this paper because it shows something kind of interesting. So again, we're looking at these invasion fronts where the cookies are and aren't, and we measured bird communities, and we thought we might see a decline in native birds where the coqui was invading. At least that was kind of what we went out to see. And what we found instead was that there were a lot more non-native birds where the coquis are. This was kind of interesting because we didn't expect to see a positive response to the frogs. And when we looked at the data closely by species, we found out that what we were mostly seeing was that these birds that might actually eat frogs are increasing where these invasions are happening. And so it's birds like the common myna and the red-billed luthrix and the Chinese wame that we've actually observed them in the field on occasion eating frogs, and it seems like it's actually increasing these non-native bird populations. So that's kind of an interesting result and maybe something that we care about. And then the last kind of thing looking at these small mammal responses is this work by Shane Hill, where, again, I guess we shouldn't be surprised that we're finding measurable differences now, but we're still surprised by these results. We found that where the coquis are invading, the mongoose populations are increasing. But the rat populations are decreasing. And we've thought about this a little bit more. There's 3 rat species in Hawaii. The rat species that's decreasing is the one that the mongoose is kind of most likely to eat. So what we think is going on is that the coquis are providing a novel prey resource for the mongoose. Those mongoose populations are increasing, and the rats are either being consumed by mongoose, and we do find them in the stomachs, or they're just avoiding those places because there's a lot of mongoose there, which is kind of interesting. And our camera trapping data supports this. The mongoose, they chow down on dead frogs. We saw a lot of that with our camera traps. Oh, I forgot to mention, we also looked at nest predation rates in these plots, and the rats were the greatest nest predators, but we didn't see any difference in the coqui and non-coqui plots for nest predation. And we think that that's because the rats are maybe declining a little bit where the coquis are. And while the mongoose are increasing and they're also nest predators, they're not the dominant nest predators, so there's just not really a significant difference developing there. Okay, so to summarize, yes, coquis, these invasive frogs, can change insect communities where they invade. They're not competing with native birds, at least not measurably. I guess I maybe didn't say that, but we did see native birds in these plots, but we never saw a response of them to the coquis. But we did see non-native birds increasing where the coquis are. We saw mongoose increasing as well, but a rat species declining. So there seems to be this kind of new food web developing where the coquis is invading, and it does seem to measurably be affecting all these other species. So it's kind of an interesting story that's coming out of it. Did you guys have any questions about that? No?
So the avian predators, rats, ship rats, black rats?
The
Or
Pacific rats?
Exolans, Pacific rats. I got
Yes.
the impression you're saying that the mongoose is raiding the Pacific rats, Ratosectolans, but not affecting
Yeah,
the black
the
rats.
black
Yeah.
rats or the Norway rats,
The
yeah.
arboreal, the tree,
Yes.
the black rats.
Yes, yeah,
So,
yeah. That's what we think.
ship rats are just notorious bird predators, and mongoose never touch them.
Oh,
I mean, not like in a
yeah.
controlling kind of way.
Yeah, and I hadn't worked with the mongoose and rats really before this study, but our co-author Aaron Shields does, and we also saw mongoose doing a lot more nest predation at higher nests than he thought we ever would see. So maybe they're a little more arboreal or becoming than we thought, but yeah, there's a little separation between some of the rat species and the mongoose in terms of how arboreal they are. Any other comments about that? So I have a PhD student that looked at the human dimension of this, and I think this might be relevant to you guys thinking about controlling non-native species. So she, the first thing she did was she went to 12 communities across the Big Island and talked to 87 households, and she did these hour-long interviews with them about the coquilles. And I should say that, maybe this is obvious, but in Puerto Rico, people really like the frog, the coquille. It's kind of their mascot. So if you've ever been to Puerto Rico and you're in the airport, like there's frogs on, all their stuff. And so anyway, the coquille's like, and it's in their folklore, it's in their nursery rhymes. So they really like the coquille and they're used to it, and it's part of their nocturnal forest and the sounds, they grew up with it. And the thought has always been that people in Hawaii hate the coquille because of the sound. And we wanted to see if that was true or not. And so she did these surveys where she interviewed people, and she found some interesting things. So what she found was that on the Big Island, so an island where people were pretty familiar with the frog, the people that felt most strongly against the frog, most negative about the frog, were people that didn't have any frogs on their property. And the people that did have coquilles started feeling less negative about them. And this was particularly true of homeowners that had coquille frogs. So this is kind of interesting because what her study was showing was this habituation, she called it, to the coquille. And the idea that people can get used to a species, even a really noisy, loud one that's right outside your window, if you're living with it for a while. And maybe especially if you think you can't get out of that situation, like you're a homeowner, and you're like, well, I could sell my house and move somewhere else, or I could, I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, but I think that there's like a psychological kind of reason for this, where people kind of decide that it's not so bad. So that's something kind of interesting that she found. And she also found on the Big Island that how negatively they felt towards the frog didn't influence whether or not they were willing to manage the frog. I didn't mention this, but a lot of the control for the coquille was being done on the ground by communities and just individuals volunteering their time. So the county would rent out the equipment and even give them the chemicals, but it was the communities that were doing a lot of this spraying. And so having that community buy-in and involvement was like potentially a big part of whether or not they could control them. And so she followed this up. Her second chapter, she sent out a mail survey where she did it to all the islands. So in this case, you might view the Big Island again as like an island where people are more familiar. And the other islands, they've heard about the coquille, but they probably don't have as much personal experience. And the negative feelings were much stronger on the islands that didn't have coquilles. So again, it was like this fear of them and what they've heard about them that made people kind of feel more against them. But people that had more experience with them were kind of like, and that attitude also, so on the Big Island, their attitude toward the practice itself. So if they thought that the spraying was going to work, they were more likely to do it. But if they didn't think it was going to work, then they weren't going to do it. And so that was kind of interesting. And on the other islands, what most motivated them to do management of the frog was what she characterized in her surveys as a societal norm. So like if they thought their neighbors expected them to do something, then they would do something. So it was kind of this peer pressure is what motivated people on those other islands to take action. So since these islands didn't really have infestation, mostly what they were doing was things like checking nursery plants if they bought them to see if they had frogs, and making sure they weren't like establishing a population. But I think that this is important because I think it shows that there's like a growing tolerance of non-natives, and I think that this can hinder control efforts if you don't start them early, when that fear is still there, and people are more motivated to act. So I think that's kind of the implications of her stuff. Okay, so I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about reptile invasions, because I've also been working more with this global data set looking at reptile invasions. And I think it's hard for people to think about frog invasions as being that negative. even though we're measuring all these responses to frog invasion. But maybe reptile invasions are something that people can grasp it a little bit more, like, okay, I can see how that could be bad. The Burmese python, for example, the brown tree snake. I think we have some notorious reptile invaders that people like are concerned about. And so let me ask you guys, what do you think determines whether or not a reptile or an amphibian invades where it's been introduced? What are the most important factors?
No predators.
No predators? Okay, so the community, maybe? Like what's there?
Make it niche.
What was that?
Make it niche.
Okay, make it niche.
The habitat disturbance.
Okay.
Property bill pressure, number of introductions.
Yes.
Prey base.
Here it is. One other big thing. Maybe.
I couldn't hear one of those, but fecundity, just
Okay.
productivity.
Yeah.
Life history of the.
Life
invader.
history, traits in general. Yeah. So he said propagular pressure. You guys know what propagular pressure is, right? The number of individuals introduced and the number of times they're introduced. So just basically, if you keep trying, or if you introduce really big populations, they're more likely to establish.
We're fish and game, we understand the concept quite
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
but we try to do it on purpose and fail half the time. We understand
Yes.
you have to keep trying, keep
Yes,
trying,
you
keep
fail
trying.
half the time.
Yes, we get that.
Yeah, but then like sometimes it happens. Even the same place, right?
Sometimes we give up.
So why might it not happen?
Christ only knows. I don't know. Seriously, I mean, this is pretty deep theory, and doesn't seem like we actually have great answers. Just a lot of great hypotheses. Trying to develop answers, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so the coqui frog, actually, very recently, they're finding them in Los Angeles outside of nurseries. Do you think the coqui frog could get into Utah?
Arrive or persist.
Well, if you get here, right? In a plane, maybe.
That was the question.
So can it establish?
I don't know.
Probably not.
Why not?
The environment's not very
Yeah,
suitable.
right? Okay. So those are the three main things. You guys named them. I just thought that maybe. But so there's all these species traits, life history traits, reproductive ability, whether or not there's a vacant niche, prey base. You guys kind of mentioned all those, right? And people, I think, a lot of times people think of these first, maybe, like these species traits. No? I don't know. The event-based traits are things like how many times did you try to introduce them? How long ago did you try to introduce them? How long have you been trying to introduce them? How many did you try to introduce? And we know, especially when we're purposely trying to introduce things, that those things matter, right? So it's going to work this way too. Like an introduced species, if you just introduce one, it's not parthenogenic, it's probably not going to establish, right? This is a huge variable that people in invasion ecology did not appreciate for a really long time, like how big of a role that plays and whether or not things establish. And then there's the location variables. And one of that's climate matching, like can you introduce the brown tree snake to Alaska? Probably not, right? But also maybe other things about the location, like whether predators are there or something that could be in there. So at the end of the day, globally, for all the data that we have for reptiles, birds, mammals, amphibians, pretty much everything, about half the time they establish. So half the time they don't. How much do these various things matter? So if you guys had to weigh these, what do you think is the most important or least important? Everybody wants to wager a
That's
guess?
a great location.
Location seems like it would matter. And you can measure that climatically or whatever, but anybody else want to wager a guess? So, well, we looked at this with reptiles, and what we found was, okay, everything matters a little bit, but these location level variables are the most important. then these event level things like propagular pressure, and last is these species level traits, which a lot of times we worry about, but really don't matter as much as like how much we're introducing them and whether or not it's the right location for them.
And that's the basis by which we play with whitelist or blacklist regulation stuff.
Yeah.
It's just kind
Yeah.
of silly to me, but anyway.
But that includes a lot of species level stuff, doesn't
That's what I
it?
mean,
Yeah, right. And so for a long time, the field, I'm like hoping it's switching, but for a long time, the field was really focused on just like what's the reproductive ability and, things like that, that play a role, but are not the most important variable. So that's kind of all I wanted to say about that. But I'll move into, so this is again a global analysis of amphibian reptile invasions. Maybe you would have guessed this. What is the main way that amphibians and reptiles are introduced?
People do it.
People do it, yes. So all these white bars are people. And then the number one is through the pet trade. So, there's this story, an anecdotal story about Florida where like 20 species or so were introduced by some herp fanatic that like just wanted to have these things in his backyard. You can imagine that would be really possible in Florida. My species, the coquille, was a stowaway, so it wasn't really in the pet trade. But if you think about a lot of other species, it probably makes sense. The Burmese python, right? Some species that you guys have here. And when people have analyzed this pet trade data, they've found that what influences their probability of being released from the pet trade into the wild is the quantity of them on the market. So things like red-eared sliders that are in every pet store you've ever been in, right, are much more likely to be introduced to places. And also how long they've been on the market. So things that are like more exotic and rare and just recently getting in the pet trade are maybe not as likely to be established as things that have been on the market for a long time. If they're cheap, it's another association with them being established from the pet trade. And also things that are larger and live longer have a more likely chance of being established from the pet trade. And I think that might have to do with people's connection with those pets, like they don't want to flush them down the toilet, so they let them go or something. But I think, and I am not an expert on the non-native reptiles and amphibians in Utah per se, but I was kind of trying to figure out like what species are here, and knowing that we have this exponential curve of increasing number of herp introductions and probably going to add to this list. You guys can tell me if these are right or not. This is what I found kind of on the web. But a lot of them are pet release, pet trade herps, right?
The gecko, I call a commensal stowaway,
Oh, is it a stowaway?
I would say.
Yeah. People do have them as pets, though. Some people do. Yeah. And these guys, I was reading, might have escaped from some, I don't know, they might have migrated here somehow.
Actually, it's
Fish
not
and Game might have
clear
done
that
that.
the spiny softshell is non-native to Utah. Our agency says it's introduced, but they may be native.
They may be native. Yeah, you guys have red-eared sliders somewhere.
We've got them out on the river.
Walking distance.
They're introduced. Yeah.
All
All the rest of
we
those
see
are-
them on lunchtime walks.
So which one of those reptiles are the biggest pest for Utah?
Well,
At
I'm sure
reptiles
people
and
don't like the
amphibians.
snapping turtles. I don't know.
The
The
bullfrog may
bullfrogs?
actually interfere with some of our management activities more than any of the others.
How does it interfere?
We're trying to conserve these spotted frog and bullfrogs, literally keep them
Okay.
and
The
compete with
tadpoles.
them, so they.
Environmental reservoir of a disease. Fungus.
Yeah, like the bullfrog spreading it, you mean? Is it? Okay, so, this is just a little plug, but I recently wrote a chapter with a couple co-authors about controlling terrestrial vertebrate invasive species and frogs in particular. And none of these frogs are in Utah. The coqui, the greenhouse frog, the cane toad, and the Cuban tree frog, they're more issues in our subtropical states like Florida or Hawaii. But there are some interesting things that they've come up with in these states to kind of control these guys that may be relevant. This is for catching cane toads. They light it, it's like a solar powered light, the insects come there and then the cane toads walk and they fall into these tubs and they catch a bunch of them that way. But yeah, I think more specifically to Utah, certainly this is from a class field trip that I do with my class, and we go look at bullfrog tadpoles because we can find them. And they're these little like permanent water bodies. They're actually in different places than the native frogs where I am. Maybe that's not true down here. Because we have, like, boreal chorus frogs are more wetlandy, and these guys overwinter.
Some overlap with the leopard frogs.
Yeah, 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 that's true. But, I mean, I think if we're looking at ease of controlling these guys, probably the best place to start is the pet trade, because that's where, if we want to stop more species from getting in, that's where a lot of them are coming from, or at least people releasing them, not wanting to kill them. So, I mean, I think that there's some creative ways to do that. Like, pet stores are getting better about these kinds of things. They only sell male guinea pigs now and things like that. So maybe there's ways of thinking about doing that with herps. I don't know if they do that with herps or not. Yeah, so there's always the chemical control options. They work pretty well in eradicating coquis from places in Hawaii. I'd say that chemical with mechanical, like removing vegetation or habitat, was the most effective way of getting rid of them. But there's like a developing list of things out there for controlling these things. And at least in Logan, I think I don't know that you can get rid of bullfrogs, you know, but there's certainly places where ponds are stock full of bullfrog tadpoles, and everything else I've ever caught in there is also non-native. So, you know, like you could chemically treat. Would that reduce them from that whole area? I don't know if you did it year after year in the Cutler area. If that's like, if there's a few places where they're mostly breeding, maybe. Maybe you could reduce them over there. I don't know. Do you guys have ideas?
Do you know if there's anything that is specific to bullfrogs that wouldn't affect native frogs?
Oh, that wouldn't affect native frogs. I don't know about that. Probably not. But there are some things that seem to target frogs and not some fish. But if you're, I mean, so you guys have bullfrogs right in with your native species that you're concerned about, and it's not spatially separated at all. I don't know if that's true in Logan, because the rare species that you guys have, the boreal toads, are up in the canyon. So
Yeah, it's leopard frogs again. We've got leopard frog right down
We've probably got bullfrog and Columbia spotted frogs cohabitating in what we call the middle Provo, between Jordanelle Reservoir and Deer Creek Reservoir.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a trade-off, right? Like, in some places, maybe you could get away with doing it without hurting the natives, but if they're just gonna migrate back in, it might not matter. But we don't have bullfrogs up in the canyon right now in Logan, so, I mean, there might be reason if you see them to, like, use chemical control to stop them from establishing there, especially because there are boreal toads up there.
Is there any temporal difference in their, breeding? And, could you address it through?
Well, yeah.
I don't know.
Bullfrogs breed pretty late in the summer, one of the latest, and certainly after boreal toads are breeding, so maybe you could do it after they've left metamorph for the year. The other thing about bullfrogs, and I don't know how well people have studied them in Utah, but in a lot of places, and from what I can tell around Logan, they're overwintering as tadpoles. And so it's possible to treat these places in the winter, and there would be no native frogs in there. You might have to test how long there's residual chemicals. But that might be something to think about.
The largest fraction of the challenge I would not describe as technical. That's,
Yeah.
What was that, Jimmy?
I would just say the largest component of the overall challenge is not technical.
Oh,
It's just logistics.
It's will and attention span.
Yeah,
And do
willingness
we,
to
I
do it.
mean,
Yeah.
there's only so much we can
Resource
do.
allocation.
Yeah.
Yeah, resource allocation and perception of, is
Importance.
it doable?
Yeah.
I mean, it's doable,
Yeah.
it's a giant pain.
Yeah.
And it's just not
And it might not work.
worth it. to
I
us,
mean,
think.
and that's where I kind of get back to this. Because I think if we could, like maybe bullfrogs are here to stay. Maybe green frogs are here to stay. Maybe red sliders clearly are here to stay. But I don't know what that next species is. But maybe that one's not here to stay if we tell people a little bit more about not letting their pets go, or if we have some other mechanism for capturing pets that people want to release. Like, I would prefer to get my guinea pig from the Humane Society than PetSmart if I could, but didn't have any. I don't know, but that would maybe be more logistically doable, right? Or, like, I know there's all these forms you sign when you get pets at the pet store too now about like, well, so a lot of that's about being humane to your pet, I think, but there might be ways to also incorporate some education about when you're done with this pet that lives 20 years, especially turtles. You know, what do you do? Yeah, I don't know. That's my proposition. Yeah, I don't have like too much time and I don't want to go to the very end. But I'm also doing work in Alaska, and I'll just mention it briefly, but this work is looking at migration timing of birds up into these breeding areas in Alaska. And I can just show you some pictures of that. But so the idea behind the work, not running down too much stuff, is just that if birds are shifting their migration timing, then they might not be getting the resources that they need when they get to Alaska to have their nests and molt and then migrate south. And so people are looking at this concept, and it's called trophic mismatch. And it's this idea that we might be getting earlier breeding seasons in these areas, but that long-distance migrants might not be getting the right messages to get there on time. And so I'm doing some work up in this wildlife refuge up there where there's like 1 million migratory birds, and we're looking at how forage quality and things are changing in relation to the start of the growing season and bird migration timing. So I won't get too much into that because we're still in the process of writing up a lot of this stuff anyway. But that's other stuff I'm interested in, and so I'll just kind of skip through that, just in the interest of time. But those are the students that have worked for me in Hawaii, and these are a lot of my Hawaii funding sources and my Utah crew and funding sources. Yeah, and that's it. So. That's all I have.
So has anybody here worked on CIT proclamation? Does that sort of get, so this is people need a permit to import animals or transport animals through the state and that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Does that get at her first concern? Is it, do we deal with like pet trade that much? Do all the pet stores in the state need a CIT?
Not necessarily. In the CIT, it identifies certain species that need a permit and some that don't require any documentation at all and so forth. So most of the pet trade is on that, at least the legal stuff.
Yeah, one thing we dealt with at Awful was the pet trade lobby is pretty strong and pretty reluctant to put any controls on anything. They're beginning to become willing to hand out some informational brochures and pamphlets with people's pets. But on the back end, I mean, you gotta look at the reason why people release these things.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
because they don't like killing things.
Right,
So you've got to have a place and a refuge for these things to be housed, quote unquote, for these people to actually acquiesce to your request to not release them, and we don't have that, you know, and we don't have any partners to do that right now. I think that's a major issue. Because non-native or not, people, first off, people I don't think recognize non-native versus native in general, at least with fishes. And time and time again, they think that, you know, these nasty critters are something we should conserve. And if they own them, it takes that one step further. You know,
Yeah.
You mentioned it, there's the whole, this is my pet, this is my friend, this is, you know, even though it's a turtle, whatever.
yeah. And
they're
I'm
not
letting it
gonna
be
kill
free.
Yeah. I want it to live a long and healthy life at this local pond.
Right, right. I mean, so Florida might be a place to look as an example of this, because I know that they've started these places where you can take your pets when you're done with them. Like,
The old frog song.
yeah, yeah.
Out of pasture.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it's thinking really long-term and big picture, but if that's the best management for these types of things, like, maybe that is where we should be investing our effort and money, instead of dumping chemicals into ponds and knowing it's not gonna do anything, right?
Well, and the propagule pressure thing is it, to me, it works both ways. So when we try to do eradication through mechanical removal or chemical removal, unless we have a very constrained population like fish in a reservoir,
Right.
good luck.
Yeah,
Because, you know, your likelihood of establishment,
yeah,
50%, depending on effort, depending on numbers. Well, take that, flip it on its head, your likelihood of eradication, 50%, depending on effort, depending on numbers, and sometimes even that isn't a linear trend, it's just kind of all over the place. So we struggle. The best way to do it is just to not get established in the first place.
yeah.
Do you think outreach efforts are effective on things like illegal walleye introductions and that
Ask
kind of
this
stuff?
kid right here.
Crayfish.
So I was actually just gonna bring this up. Hopefully this next year, we're gonna see something new in Utah where our aquatic invasive species program is partnering with the Invasive Species Action Network up in Montana on their Don't Let It Loose campaign. And they're gonna be coming down, their team, and visiting, I think it's between 150 and 200 pet stores here, providing them with all sorts of outreach material, also recruiting some of those into what's essentially a take-back program for pets when people are done with them and no longer want them or can't take care of them. They've been very successful in Montana. Utah's going to be, I believe, the third state they're going to attempt to try this in, so we're pretty excited about that. It's a pretty big effort, but yeah, outreach is huge, and just from our boat inspection program, we're going on year 11 of that, and every year our outreach efforts have escalated, and the awareness is there now, and so now we're oftentimes coming to boaters that have already done what we're asking them to do. So.
Any other questions?
I just want to tell her we have our own nursery trade vectored invasive hylet here in Utah. If you want to go play with that one, it's just a tree growing down in St. George. But
We have also, if you like eastern fox squirrels, they're invading pretty successfully along the river corridor here. I saw them actually on the campus here about 2 weeks ago. think we've passed that threshold.
Yeah. We could have controlled that, and we chose not to, which seems to be what, as an agency, we always decide not to stop the invasion, so. The box squirrels, they're doing exactly what I predicted they would do the day that I was told we weren't gonna do anything.
Yeah, and if you, it seems, at least like in Hawaii, if you don't do something right away, forget about it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a very short window where decisions have to be made.
Yeah. When the decision was made, there were a handful of box squirrels in Utah. Hard to know exactly how many, but a very small number, maybe fewer than 6. And anyway, that opportunity is long past. There's not anything we're going to be able to do about it. It's going to cost Utah a lot of money. The economic damage that these squirrels are going to do. It's anyway. I think we'll live to regret that decision. By the way, the frogs in St. George, hard to know. We don't know whether they're native or not. They could be non-native, but yeah, they're really taking over.
Sudden appearance and rapid spread suggests.
Pardon me?
As the sudden appearance and rapid spread would suggest probably.
Yeah, I don't know. Thing is, we don't know what we originally had. Is the problem. But anyway, they very well could be non-native.
Okay, well, let's thank Karen for coming down and